disciplinary text. If you just go through the different readings in the text, really they're written from people talking about generally the same phenomena, which is to say cyberculture, and they're talking about, in general terms, like computer-mediated culture. Like, and the more general question being asked in the text itself is, what are the implications in terms of questions of gender and sexuality and ideology and writing and thinking of living really in a high-intensity technological culture and the kind of culture that we live within. And the premise of the text in some ways is, and I'll go through these in a moment, the premise of the text in some ways is that, that technologies, from the point of view of a lot of writers in these texts, is not simply consumer products. The premise of the text is, when it talks about the technology and technology, media, and politics, is that technologies refer to forms of representation, that technologies represent like cinematic forms of representation or video, or ways in which we imagine the world to ourselves and to others, and ways in which we begin to represent the world. So it's like about that in some ways, and so it really seeks immediately to take the term technology and to really broaden it, and to say that if we're going to talk about, for example, politics today, well, if we want to talk about politics reasonably, we better really have a good understanding of the relationship between technologies of communication and how politics actually occurs. In the same way, it'll say if we're going to talk about media today, then maybe we better understand something about how the media is transformed very quickly into media machines, into sometimes like apparatuses of seduction, and sometimes like in 9/11 for me, just from my own perspective, I say, well, because I really do a lot of, as a political scientist, do quite a bit of analysis and thinking through propaganda machines. I thought for myself, there's a tragedy here, but the tragedy, as a writer for the Guardian newspaper pointed out today, has long ago been hijacked in favor of what he described as a media propaganda machine. So on the first anniversary of 9/11, it just strikes me that the tragedy has been hijacked to mobilize public opinion to move in quite a different direction. And I'm just waiting for the other proverbial shoe to fall and see how quickly this kind of emotion that's going to be generated today will then be used by the state, by the American state, to get people ready for, the missiles falling on Iraq and things like this. These kind of transitions. So, of course, in media technology, sorry, we're running out of room. Are you comfortable? Yeah, it's not good. I know, just before I go on, why not, some of you could just move down, because these will fit 4 seats. And then everyone feel comfortable. Yeah, I think you can come in actually, here. Yeah, would you mind just moving down a little bit? You're going to stay there? Yeah, okay. I think just if you go right here, you'll be comfortable. I think these rows can take 4 seats comfortably. Everyone comfortable? Okay. So this book that we're going to deal with then, we start off like with the class itself is really, really multidisciplinary class, which means that in the discussions we have, which will be really great because everyone's going to be beginning from a very different sort of starting point. And what I'll try to keep in mind, teaching the class, but you should also keep in mind taking the class, is we'll try to do discussions which take into account that we're speaking to people, there's people from political science here, people from film, culture and communications, translation, theater. So we'll just try to find like common languages by which we can speak to one another. And then it's sort of like Northrop Frye's educated imagination in some ways. So let me just start off today, if I can, just with a little bit of a lecture. It's not much of a lecture. I'd just like to start off with telling sort of 2 stories. Because the book itself starts with I think what really lies behind this book in some ways, from the point of view of the 2 editors of the book, David Bell and Barbara Kennedy, is this other book that was written in the 1980s by William Gibson, a book, Neuromancer. And a book in some ways sort of like rewritten in a different way, a really great book called Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. So they have, both those books really articulate a very different view of technology, media, and politics, or of cyberculture. Like in a book this book, which you can pick up probably most Montreal bookstores, a book called Neuromancer. It's about the relationship between the human body and electronic culture. And this book is really introduces like a sort of a whole new mythology about it. The whole new mythology, it says, is in fact how do you get beyond your body, and how do you get into actually travel within electronic culture, so that you're not sort of sitting outside like a wired world. You're not sitting outside streams of data, but you're actually traveling through the light arrays and through the high-speed capillaries of the electronic universe. You actually travel within it. Now in this book, and sort of like the novelistic imagination of the book, you actually put on kind of hardware and you jack into cyberspace itself. You actually begin to leave your earthly body, and you begin to travel through the streams and the capillaries and the data fields of corporations, where corporations are understood as sort of like software programs. You're suddenly inside Neuromancer itself. And now for the author, who's this really interesting person named William Gibson. He's an expatriate American. He lives in Vancouver. And he really began to imagine what would this world of technology be. He said, really, we're entering into a world of cyberspace. We're entering into a world where, like, the data all around us, it almost takes the form of like a global brain that we can enter into. And we experience it as almost a form of a consensual hallucination itself. He says that this consensual hallucination, this electronic culture, this cyberspace, is how in fact we experience social reality today. So for William Gibson, writing in the early 1980s, the cyberspace is not something outside of ourselves, but it's actually the electronic world within which we live. Now this is followed out by another really interesting writer, Derek de Kerkhoff, who's he has a very deeply utopian, enthusiastic vision of technology. And he's really written a good book, and where his book follows Marshall McLuhan, he says really technology is not something that's just products, or it's not simply media that we see. He says really every day that we get up, we almost wrap ourselves in the skin of technology. That technology for us is sort of a second skin of culture. The technology is how we think about the world, it's how we see, it's how we feel, it's how we receive news about the world, it's how we begin to understand our identity and how we begin to understand other people's identity itself. Now in the 1980s, when you have writers like William Gibson writing a book, really tremendously influential book like Neuromancer, it's kind of like sort of like a shockwave in some ways. And people sort of read that book and say, well, it's like science fiction. But then suddenly you live like in the year, what are we at now, 2002, the dying ember days of 2002, the fall days. And suddenly you look around the world and things that were written about, evocatively in the 1980s are no longer simply literature. It's almost as if the literature of a book like Neuromancer or Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, these great, really important books about speaking about cyberculture, have suddenly literally just jumped off the page and become the culture within which we live. I'd just like to start, and I hope I can do it well, but just giving you a sense of like two stories about this that I saw recently. About 2 years ago, I was in San Jose, California, and I went to one of my favorite all-time museums, which is called the Tech Museum in San Jose, California. And San Jose, of course, used to be nothing but lettuce fields, basically. It's where immigrant workers and Cesar Chavez and others would come up. It's where, the union movements, the attempt by Chicanos to unionize farm workers actually began in San Jose, California. But if you go to San Jose now, you'll get off the bus as I did, and you'll see sort of a little monument for that, and it immediately is in your mind that there's a labor history here. But what really strikes you is that that labor history has been sort of obliterated, because San Jose is, of course, really the epicenter of Silicon Valley. And it's where the major corporations that grew Silicon Valley and all the Silicon Valleys of the world really originated. And sort of to celebrate their triumph, they actually built a museum called Tech Museum. And on Tech Museum, there's a wall of granite outside the museum, and chiseled into it is this saying that goes something like this. It says that, America has always been built by pioneers, by those who haven't been contented to stay at home and haven't, and been afraid to face uncertainties and to struggle for freedom, but they moved westward in a migration. And at one point they came to San Jose and they founded Silicon Valley in the technology industry. This is not a land for the fearful or for the anxious or for those who are afraid to take risks. Something of that sort is on their plaque. And I sort of read that plaque, and I said to myself, well, this is really hubris in some ways. This is really a kind of daring people, because I thought as a Canadian, I thought, what would we say? We would make the statement for myself. The statement would be much more ambivalent. It's like Margaret Atwood's notion of surviving the storm as the Canadian triumph in some ways. But you go inside the Tech Museum, and the day that I was there, they just had this great art exhibit that was there. It was called Experiments in the Future of Reading, which really took me, because I had really been thinking a lot about, like in the age of digitality, in the age of electronic communications, what happens to the act of reading? And so Xerox PARC, which is Xerox's experimental research site, got about 10 or 20 artists together and gave them this they called the Red Team. And the Red Team had a project. What happens to reading and writing in a digital age? Like what happens when we don't have like book culture like this anymore, or that's not the primary emphasis, but in fact the screens that we have actually come to mean something, ways of communicating information and reading. Are we going to have the same kind of book? Are we simply going to reproduce books on the screen? So they came up with this great exhibit called Experiments in the Future of Reading. And it had a very practical purpose, and that was simply really to design new consumer products, because they want to do an educational division. But as you went through it, it's really interesting, because you would have like touch screens, beautiful touch screens that would fill with text which shift at any moment to follow another storyline, or single words that you can touch that suddenly open up into almost like new novellas. Or they had this beautiful, fantastic light array table, measured maybe probably about 7 by 7. It was a very large light array table. And on the table were simply letters of the alphabet in sort of random fashion itself. And what you could do is actually you could begin to write stories by physically moving the table itself. And as you tilted the table, literally letters would begin to tumble across the light array and fall off the table into who knows where they were falling, or they could fall back. And if you learned how to do sort of hand-eye reading, you could actually begin to manipulate the light array table and begin to write sentences and begin to write words. And I thought, well, this is really an interesting technology. It's sort of for children, but it's got a pretty adult implication to it, because it really begins to reconfigure the act of reading itself. It was I thought it was like really learning a new form of handwriting for new electronic tribes in some ways. Like really saying that, the blast of technology is going to rewire how we think, and it's certainly going to rewire how we write itself. Now, those were all great, but my personal favorite was actually a children's book, which sat in sort of a corner. And to experience this children's book, you sit down in an easy chair, and they try to hide it, but if you look behind it, you got a big computer, and it's got a processor sitting behind it and stuff like this. And this children's book told the story of a cool cat doing the jazz scene in San Francisco. Sort of the mythology that San Francisco likes to live on, although it doesn't necessarily live up to it. Except this time, rather than reading the book, you actually play the reading. You sit in a comfortable armchair. It's equipped with micro speakers. It's got a mega computer tucked away behind the chair. You open the book, you run your fingers over the pages, and suddenly the sounds of jazz on the written page suddenly surround your ears. The cool cat at a club used to be called the Purple Onion, or another club called the Hungry Eye, an after-hours club down by the docks, begins to come on the screen itself. And the cool cat begins then to move and to play. But to actually read the book, you don't actually read. You actually run your fingers over the text itself. And as you run your fingers over the text, suddenly the sounds of music fill the air. And suddenly you find yourself, you can control both the velocity of the music and the amplification of the music, its volume, by moving your hands like this, or by moving your hands up and down away from the book itself. Suddenly you're no longer reading the book, but the reading is really beginning to play your own senses. It begins to play you, and you begin to play it. It's an entirely new form of what Marshall McLuhan would say, tactile reading. You're reading not simply with the eye, but you're reading, in fact, with your whole body. You are, in fact, immersed in the book itself. What Neuromancer can only imagine is sort of jacking into cyberspace suddenly becomes a world in which you literally have the experience of jacking into the book itself. You are part of the book. Your body is part of the book itself, and you are playing the reading. Now, for myself, I got up and I sort of liked the story of the cool cat and wondered what was going on. And I thought, well, what a fabulous way to really also to envision the electronic city. You know, because you're sitting in San Francisco, just down the bay from San Francisco. And San Francisco, of course, is the most wired city in the world, I believe. Much more wired than even the inhabitants of San Francisco know. Sometimes with many good results, but also with many dangerous results. It's amazing if you go around Berkeley and San Francisco, for example, how many people have suffered really real damages to their immune system. You say, well, I wonder if the density of wiring and wired culture in the city might have something to do with damage to immune systems. Is this city really a kind of experiment in whether a technological society is healthy to live in? So there's like ambivalent things which come out of the city. But in this experiment itself, I thought back to the readings of like a great Canadian writer, Marshall McLuhan, who really, like in a book like Understanding Media, really said, let's think about what electronic culture means for the eye and the ear and the tongue and how we understand world itself. And McLuhan said this, he said, in traditional reading culture, the eye is always privatized. The eye is always shut up inside the privacy of the central nervous system. It's always shut up within the privacy of our own skull. The eye is always isolated from other senses. And when you stop with modern reading practices, like when you stop communal reading, in which you would read out loud to one another, and suddenly we shut ourselves up in the practice of reading where we simply read with the eye, read to ourselves, and we're even admonished. Have you ever, I don't know if your grade school was like mine, but I would always move my lips when I would read, and teachers would say, oh, you mustn't move your lips when you read. And I thought, well, I don't know, understand why not. But then when I read McLuhan, I understood why not. The eye is really going to be privatized. Reading will become a private act. It'll become a silent act itself. In the future, though, of electronic reading, like in this tiny art experiment called Experiments in Reading, suddenly the eye goes public. It reconnects to the other senses. It connects notably to the ear. You hear the sounds. And it connects very directly to the hand itself. Because you do more than read the text, you actually play the text. And the text plays itself back to you. And the ways in which you move your own body in relationship to the text is how you begin to experience the text. You are no longer in the old modernist world of the private eye. Suddenly, and sitting in San Jose Tech Museum, San Jose, California, you are in the world of the electronic eye. You are in the world of the public eye. You are in the world in which dreamers like McLuhan and others can only think about. You're in the world of tactile reading. Literally tactility, a new relationship that's being rewired between the hand and the ear and the eye itself. You touch the page at any point, and the sounds of jazz being written about can be instantly heard. You're actually in the sound field of the book. You move your hands closer to the, can you just grab a chair from there? Okay, we'll have to, I'm sorry. Some people who are 3 will have to just push down a little bit so people can get in. Did you wish to sit down here? Great. It's the end, therefore, of passive reading. It's the end of passive reading and the beginning of in-depth participation in the electronic book. According to this experiment, the future of reading will be fun. The future of reading will be experimental. It'll be deeply immersive. But it's also going to be unpredictable because it's a full body, full mind, full ear experiment. Instantly, you're no longer reading books. You are the reading itself, and the book is beginning to read you. Yes?
It's also going to be really expensive to make a book too, because you have to make all the sound production and everything yourself.
Yep.
So you can't just sort of be an independent publisher and do all these nice fancy things yourself.
Yeah. That's a very good question, but it's an open question though, isn't it? I just have to, if you don't mind, these classes are being filmed, And so we don't have, I've asked Patrick to get Mike in here, so with questions you can just speak into the mic. But until then, if you don't mind, if I just try to briefly repeat the question, because then we can have a discussion. So the question was, that this means the book itself is going to be really expensive technically to create. Is that a fair summary?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If it's not, slap my face and we'll go on.
Well, you just said that in the future reading will be fun, experimental, and deeply immersive.
According to this,
so they still are, though.
Yeah.
Right now, books are immersive, extremely immersive, and they are fun, and they are in a way experimental.
It's true.
So really,
It's true. That's a very good
on
argument.
a good
Yeah. So, no, that's really true. You choose any novel, if you get deeply, you could choose any writing, choose any sentence, and fall into it, and you fall into virtual worlds. You fall into worlds of the imagination. But does this, in some way, begin to rewire the field or expand, not in one form of reading, but begin another form of reading? And what would the implications of that be? That kind of question, this kind of questions, I think, is just what we should discuss in the class. So like McLuhan would say, it's the end of modernist reading, the end of the private eye. But your argument would be, well, the eye, maybe privacy itself is very ambivalent and has, deeply interesting things that happen within it. Yes?
For the most part, one would agree with McLuhan, because you could say that books, to sort of stop themselves from degenerating into oblivion or obscurity, they would have to be forcibly evolved into such an active technocracy of reading.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, then somebody could basically say, oh, a book, what's that? As opposed to just saying, oh, books are such interesting, there's such an active participation, and this mass involvement with everybody else starts saying, okay, a book is now something I see as well as read.
Yeah.
They will start mass producing them, and the prices, as previously argued, would drop. As a result, to start mass producing something, the cost to produce each volume is cheaper than if you produce them one by one.
Yeah. Well, it's a good argument. And that, of course, you go back to book culture, and you go from hardcovers to soft covers, and suddenly you have the mass book, which is available. Yeah. I mean, digital books, if I could just intervene slightly, digital books aren't necessarily expensive at all. There's lots of digital books being published these days, and they're not being done by the big corporations. They're being done by students, by a lot of students, and what I would say is nomadic thinkers working who know a little bit about technology or a lot about technology, and begin to really have an urgent question, that is, how do you use this technology to develop new forms of communication? How do you do writing that's not simply on the net, but a net form of writing itself? And cost is minimal. It's the interesting thing about the net is you can do the most fabulous things for almost minimal cost. It's why, in fact, the corporations are really frightened of this kind of net democratization of education, in some ways. Herb, and then yes. What's your name again now?
Me?
Yeah.
Leslie.
Leslie, okay.
I understand that you're bringing all these senses together, but I just feel like it's making people lazy, moving every single thing into technology. People can't sit down and enjoy a book because they don't have the attention span for long enough. It just makes me frustrated because I feel like every single, not every single thing we're doing, but so much of our culture is being pushed into technology on the web or whatever, where I don't think that it's necessary at all. And there's something so magical. You can't take your computer everywhere if you want to read the book. With an actual book, you can sit and curl up anywhere without having a little laptop. I just don't.
Leslie, that's great.
It just
I can
makes
see
me
I've touched a,
crazy.
I can see I've touched a raw nerve.
I just don't. I don't know. I feel like we're losing so much by pushing everything that way, and so much of our culture, and it's very Western, because some people can't even afford books themselves, let alone these interactive, crazy, newfangled things.
Okay, Leslie.
I don't know, that's just my 2 cents.
Well, it's more than 2 cents. That's great. Yeah.
I wasn't really thinking about the cost of buying books a lot. I was thinking the cost of production. It changes it more into a Hollywood type movie where you'll have a famous musician do a score for the book, and then you'll have someone else doing all the visuals for it, and it takes away
Yeah.
from like a book being a solitary act of one writer putting his thoughts down on paper. It makes it into more of a big, fancy production. That I think is sort of the main point of most books, at least in universities, is sort of one person's ideas on the topic or a story or so on.
It's true. We can experiment though, and I just finished writing a book called whatever, and signed a contract with the press. And then I said, well, the one thing I wouldn't sign is I have electronic rights, and I can do anything I want with them. So they said, oh, fine, who cares about electronics? And then so I'm working with a really, really fabulous young digital designer down in Toronto, and we're doing an electronic version of the book itself. And from his perspective, my perspective, it won't be the print book at all. It'll be just a very different book, but not a Hollywood production, but just like trying to use flash animations to some extent to see if you could use it creatively. And he's done a nice thing. The text begins with this sort of like short story called "It's Raining Wireless in San Francisco." So he went deep into flash codes and actually did this beautiful page where actually the pixelated alphabet begins to fall down like rain itself and forms the letters of the text itself then begin. So it's really nice, you know. You begin to have like a reflexivity between the technology and its possibilities for creativity and the writing itself. So I wouldn't say this is a real raw nerve, because I don't see this as a replacement. But I do see it as something doing something that's really interesting, is that it changes identity, you know, and for good or for bad. And we're going to have a lot of discussions about that, because like modern culture is based on separation of the senses, clearly. Separation of the eye from the hand, loss of tactility in some ways, and shuts down medieval practices of reading and writing and speaking. The digital age brings back the possibility of like a Montreal music group, Synthesasia, speaks about the possibility of reconnecting the senses as well. And not in final forms, but just in creative forays and things like this. As a person who loves books, I got to tell you, when I saw the book, like I liked the cool cat doing the jazz scene in San Francisco, but the thing that sticks on my mind a lot, but the thing that I just was beguiled by was these light array tables with tumbling letters coming off the tables and stuff. Because for myself, it was just phenomenal. It was like the alphabet began to move. It was almost as if, you know, it really posed the question that in the electronic age, you know, the words of the alphabet can't keep up to the speed of images. It's a real war between them. And so what happens, do creative things happen at that point, or does that mean the end of literacy and the end of a certain kind of culture? So, and I don't really have an answer to that. It's just an open, for myself, these are open questions. So, yes, and were there people have hands up over here? Yes?
You were talking about, at least for the digitizing of your book, you were talking about using things like Flash. Does
Yeah.
that mean that the text, or at least the content of the book reveals itself? Does the book become a show?
No, but it'll be interactive if it works. I haven't seen what Spence is really, I just saw this first part.
But does the reader maintain control of the rhythm of the book,
Yeah.
the pace of the book?
Yes, he does.
So the book reveals itself only as you want it to reveal itself?
Yes, because we're doing a little violence to Flash. Because Flash in itself is like a really boring, for myself, I've always been opposed to it. I don't know why. As soon as I saw it, I said, oh, I liked it in its first incarnation, but I don't like it anymore because it's too programmatic. And it's too predictable. You can pick up Flash. You can just predict in advance what's going to happen with Flash, because the program itself almost, you know, prescribes its content that's going to come. So this is the whole point of this, was actually to do its anti-Flash, sort of, to see if you can go inside the codes and do something interesting with it, you know, in
At
part.
your own pace?
Yeah, at your own pace. But you know, there's something to be said too, artistically, about servility to machines, about when the text takes control of things. After all, you know, if you have a text on discipline and power, then why shouldn't the text take control of your reading practices, take control of your eyes? Why not? The media does that every day. For the last 2 weeks, I've been living inside a disciplinary media machine that's taking control of my eyes, taking control of my attention. I've even been dreaming, again, of 9/11 and feeling this sense of like urgency and, you know, foreboding and things like this. And I'm so happy about Gander, people in Gander and things. You know, we all over the world, we know the full story as well. But I also sort of try to just keep in my mind that there are other stories that are not being told. Like, why don't we have a little memorial for all the civilians bombed in Afghanistan? I mean, don't their lives count for anything? They're like, these cyber machines are not just art practices. The real cyber machines are political practices. It's how politics is practiced today. And politics is really practiced when it's in the media by a very old tradition called hijacking. It literally hijacks, gets inside of us and hijacks our emotions, hijacks our ways of perceiving the world and understanding the world, and makes their story our story.
You don't think that's a byproduct, not just of the media, but of the servility to the machine, as you were talking about before?
Both definitely true. It's a story of the media, it's a story of the machine, it's also a story of ourselves. It's three. It means also, like listen to this, like the Lycos' slogan, it's perfect, freedom and unity. Well, as a political scientist, I would say you can't have freedom if you have unity. Isn't freedom having a little bit of individual autonomy, being your own person and things like this? And isn't the term unity a little bit fascist? I mean, I don't be too critical of Lycos at this point. But I mean, that seems to, I think these things bear some discussion. Because this, like the second story I would tell with this, like this is a story of, like the living with this is a story of the image matrix. Like life within, like a really utopian vision of trying to do something with the image machine. But the other side of the story is also about the image machine as well. And it's about, like a year after 9/11 and sense of like despondency is in the air and foreboding. And you have, and I'll just close the story if you don't mind for a moment. You have I just read yesterday, the past editor of Fortune magazine just wrote an editorial lamenting the sad state of the world. And he says, the United States, America, gave the world the gift of technology, of new electronic technologies. He says, we are the software writers of the world. And he said, our original utopian dream was very McLuhanite. We really believed that if we developed Silicon Valley, that we could, through like the development of the internet and the World Wide Web, we could develop a form of communication that wouldn't just be about technology, but would be about connectivity, that would create like new kind of epiphanies of communication among us and things. It would create possibilities for more freedom in the world. And he says, sadly enough, 9/11 was, what was important for him about 9/11 is that this gift was returned to us as in a kind of bad form. He says, because what we didn't realize was that not only freedom-loving people, but terrorists would learn this technology as well. That Al-Qaeda and Hamas and a whole series of insurgent, in his words, terrorist organizations would have GPS systems. They would be perfectly wired with cell phones. They'd be communicate by hidden codes hidden within banal messages sent over the internet itself. And he says, and the gift they gave us was, the explosions on the World Trade Center itself. So at the end of this, he says, so therefore, the lesson he read for 9/11 is that technology is really ambivalent. It has possibilities for freedom, but it also has possibilities for terrorism itself. And being an empiricist, at the end of this article, he said, but what can we do? We know the whole world struggles to our shores because it wishes to participate in the Declaration of Independence, in the American way of life. And even though our gift of technology as freedom has been refused, we'll have to keep trying, or some banality like that ended the article. So for myself, and I read that, like really critical. I said, well, whose story is being told? And it's interesting, his reflections on freedom versus terrorism. But also I found it really interesting, this other, complete monopolization of the possibilities of the wired world as just the American story. Like I do like an electronic journal in which I know very well from a lot of contact like with women in Iran or people in many, many different countries of the world that stories of new media and new technologies are being written every day and every minute by people in many cultures of the world. And most of the stories don't correspond to the Microsoft story of the world. There are very different ways of using the media and practicing politics itself. But those stories are generally never allowed to be told. So I think in a class on media, technology, and politics, that it would be important to sort of contrast possibilities for freedom with possibilities for new despotisms that exist. And really to take seriously like I mentioned last week, Bill Gates' book, Business at the Speed of Thought. I just couldn't emphasize that enough. It's a really important book to read, because read Business at the Speed of Thought, which really begins with this premise that corporations of the future will be nothing more than software programs. That corporations of the future will be nothing more than archiving data and harvesting information from people like ourselves. We will just be like, we will be like standing reserves, in the terms of a German philosopher. We'll be vats of data waiting to be harvested, and we will be harvested into data archives. And that data archive data will then be massaged and pixelated. And as Bill Gates says, we will peer down through the granularities of data. We'll pick out categories and subcategories of consumers. We'll have reports back from consumers on their preferences, and then we'll trap them in sort of like an indefinite kind of loop of e-commerce, which will go on. So when you read that, you contrast that story and that possibility, that reality of new technologies, with the reality of experiments in the future of reading itself. So really, the story of cyberspace is, I think, a story on one hand of this groups of people who are really saying that the technology has real possibilities for rethinking gender and writing practices and reading practices and new forms of insurgent politics. And on the other hand, you have the reality of very large globalized corporations and very large, seemingly despotic states, or states that have a lot of power and like to speak about themselves as empires, that in fact have their own idea of the direction that cyberspace should go on. And every stage of the net today, and every stage of the World Wide Web, is just this really hard struggle between these two contending groups at many different stages. So I just wanted to begin the class today then just with this little bit of reflection on these two possibilities of the internet itself. And the book Cybercultures itself, really begins with this premise. It begins with the premise that to speak about cyberculture is not to speak of something outside of ourselves, but to speak of the ways in which our forms of communication are organized, the ways in which we think are deeply penetrated by data systems within which we are within. If in fact the future for cyberspace is not simply experiments in the future of reading, but like a real cyborg kind of town like Montreal, where you can walk down the streets and you think you're a private citizen and you might not want to have any connection to technology at all, but you go to a bank machine and you want to get a little bit of money, and man, there's data flowing out of you in the bank machine, and anyone that wants to can track your movements across Canada. You can track your movements anywhere simply by tracking bank withdrawals itself. You're in fact sort of like, you're like human being, but you're deeply connected to like a machinery of information gathering. Or you go into a store to buy something so you can look pretty good walking down the streets, pay with a credit card, and suddenly you are in fact a cyborg. You in fact have a real interface with data culture and with machine culture itself. Don't necessarily know it or even think about it. It's just sort of a convenient way to have a transaction. Or go through any mall in downtown Montreal, and you better look your best, or at least have your proper kind of filmic presentation on that you would like to do, or how you look good in the video, because you're going to be data netted and under constant surveillance by a whole ubiquitous network of cameras which are guarding all those malls all the time. And if you go outside of Montreal, go to the cities of Britain or go to the United States, surveillance cameras are going to be everywhere. And the lesson that we're told is that, this is nothing about Big Brother. This is nothing about domination. It's good for you because you want to make sure that you're secure walking through these areas. So maybe a characteristic of cyberculture is that real domination is delivered to us in the language of doing things for our own good, to make us secure so that we can have credit cards, so that transactions can be much easier. And after all, who doesn't want to be under surveillance? What do you have to hide? What do you have to fear? In the United States today, there's lots of public officials saying, report anybody suspicious. Well, and there's rejoinders, like someone writing for the New York Times said, well, if you come to New York, really we're going to have to report ourselves because the whole city looks suspicious. That's the whole point of being a New Yorker. And when I read the article, I thought, well, who would I report as being suspicious in Montreal? Everybody in those terms is deeply suspicious. It's a city filled with rebels and a lot of really vital street culture itself. So cyberculture and the way in which they're talking about it, the way in which they're talking about technology, this book intends to say, well, maybe what we need today is like a new way of thinking about and understanding cyberculture, a new way of thinking about and understanding media, technology, and politics. And I think sort of the subtext of this book is like 4 rules sort of that they follow. The first thing that I think that most articles in this book are based on is a simple premise, and that is that technology cannot be understood from the outside. Technology cannot be understood from the outside, but to really understand technology or media or how politics actually goes on today, you have to get inside of these experiences. And you have to let the experience of understanding technology begin to shape your mind and begin to shift your thinking. So one, you can't understand technology from the outside, but you have to travel deeply within emergent technologies. Now there's no student that I've met that has not come to any class that I've ever taught that has not already a pilgrim of technology. I mean, most students and most people in universities are 1,000 years ahead of any professor like myself in terms of the actual experience of technology. I mean, swapping music files. Most professors aren't spending most of their nights swapping music files. Most students that I know do. Most kids in grade school are phenomenally adept at MIST. Just really have a MIST consciousness. And when MIST really hits the universities, it's going to change the whole theories of knowledge of the university, I believe. It's a generation which is perceiving the world in fundamentally different ways. Digital literacy, most people that I know can watch 7 channels of TV at the same time and sort of effortlessly if they want to, and sort of follow storylines of the different ways and begin to zap from one to the other. And it's not sort of like, because there's no great respect for narratives, it's because our minds have already adapted to the fact that there are broken narratives and there are different ways of doing things. So by the time we reach an age of maturity, people are really digitally literate and already understand technologies from the inside. And so the point of a class like this, I think, is to sort of draw collectively that understanding out and ask, well, what are the ambivalences? What are the questions that arise out of this? What happens in a culture in which technologies do 2 things that are very opposite at one and the same time? That technologies facilitate things and technologies dominate. And the domination is not necessarily old domination, but in fact, oftentimes it's very seductive. Very, very seductive. So, things to think about, yes.
I'm sure we're going to cover it a lot more as the class goes on, but just even the first premise, it just seems to present something somewhat unfair and kind of an inherent paradox, namely that when dealing with technology, one can't make up their mind until they've allowed technology to shape their mind.
Well, that's really nice. A paradox.
Technology cannot be understood from the outside, so you have to delve into technology and allow technology to shape your mind before you can have ever believed what you wanted to believe in the first place.
Yeah.
Once it shaped your mind, you can no longer believe in the first place.
Well, that's really nice. Yeah. And it might even be a bigger paradox because some of the writers in this book are going to say that if technologies are not just objects, but technologies are ways of representing the worlds to ourselves, like cinema and video and radio and books, maybe there's another technology called thinking. Maybe by the time that we get to university, we are already deeply technological thinkers. Now, I taught this class, or something like this class, in Boston a couple of years ago. And the students in the class were really different, just because it was at Boston College, a really good school. And most of the students, I don't know where you're from or background, but everyone came from basically the same areas. They all came from very affluent suburban areas, out of mostly Catholic backgrounds. And so I said, well, do you think suburbia has any influence on the way that you think? And everybody denied it. So I said, okay, let's think of suburbia as a technology, how it organizes life, how it really, privileges consumption and consumerism. What kind of books come out of suburbia? And then we went into a whole series of really deeply nihilistic texts. These are written mostly by young people who seem to me to be survivors of suburbia, the suburban experience, and sort of scratching their autobiographies as soon as they get pen to paper.
Yet you didn't have to live in suburbia to understand the reality of suburbia.
Yeah, no, that's true, but that's it's sort of. Except my next project is actually to both write, I would only write about suburbia by going to live in suburbia. Really, because this is a point of, it's a point of emphasis, that's all. Your point's really well taken. And you don't have to have primal experiences of things, but it's a point of like accent in the book, which is to say that rather than making up your mind in advance or preforming judgments on media and technology, particularly on technologies, why not try to have an experimental attitude and open yourself up to them? I'm not talking about you particularly, but opening oneself up to them. But it's only a point of accent. It's true. I mean, you don't have to have experiences of really cruel politics in the world yourself to have a real sense of sympathy and solidarity with people that suffer. There's human compassion. So it's a really good point, yes.
But the problem with that, I think, is that technology is very seductive, and so once you kind of taste it, you get embroiled in it. And for example, personally speaking, I don't like to rely too heavily on technology, but I find myself like I'm planning to buy a laptop because, won't it be convenient to have a laptop everywhere? And you kind of get sucked in, and then you're no longer thinking clearly, you're no longer looking at it from like non-judgmental perspective, because, yeah.
You got a laptop mind before you know it. Yeah. Well, it's true. It's true. The technology itself, the speed and the accessibility and the wondrous things that it can do themselves have about them a language of fascination and a language of seduction itself. But at some point in this class, let's go back to the question of whether really the ways in which we see, visualize, and think about the world, is it possible that we could also think about these as technologies? Now, someone like Marshall McLuhan says these are certainly technologies. He said because the relationship of the technologies really, the story of technology really begins with the story of the central nervous system. He says, until the advent of electronic technologies, we have our own central nervous system. We can understand technology and we have our own sort of central nervous system. Electronic technologies begin to emerge in the form of radio, in the form of our extended ears, television in the form of our extended eyes. The internet is extended consciousness. Credit cards as sort of extended forms of commerce and the movement of the body, movement of your own actions itself. And it says suddenly you have two nervous systems. You have your own biological nervous system, but you also suddenly live within an extended nervous system. Your nervous system, in his terms, has been externalized. He uses the medical term, he said, it's been ablated, it's gone outside of yourself. And so the second rule of this book is that if you don't just understand technologies from the outside, but seek to travel, experimentally within them, and do something that's really difficult, which is experience the seduction of technology while maintaining a really poised mind, then the second rule of understanding technology is that if we can't hold ourselves outside of them, then what does it mean to travel within our own extended nervous system? I mean, what if McLuhan and de Kerkhoff are correct, that we put on technology like a second skin, that technology is a skin of culture, that we wrap ourselves in technology? Just think of like living in Montreal as think of a city as a technology. We live within the skin of Montreal. And the skin of Montreal really is a technology because it's like it's about speed. The organization of freeways for fast movement of traffic. It has technologies of architecture for places where people work. It has technologies of entertainment for consumption. It has technologies of fashion, like the fashion industry itself as a way of doing things, is like splayed everywhere across the streets of Montreal. What effect does it have on us? What imprint is left on our own bodies and our own thinking by living inside a city like Montreal as the skin of our culture, What does that do to our emotions? What does it do to our ways of seeing the world? Is it just neutral? Well, that kind of question is the kind of question that, like a thinker like Marshall McLuhan would open up. When we live within an electronic culture for McLuhan, we unfathomably have left behind an old way of living. And as much as we may, like either be seduced by or be very reluctant to accept technology, that point's sort of mute. The technology and electronic culture has already deeply, deeply come inside us, and we are inside it. We are literally data flesh. We are interconnected with machines. Just as our just normal way of life. We call it, the Americans call it, peace, prosperity, and happiness. We call it, good government. We just normal consumer culture itself. It really means living within the skin of technology and within the skin of culture itself. What imprint does that have on us? What does it mean to live within a kind of medium of this sort? What happens, as McLuhan would say, when, with the act of writing, suddenly the kind of darkness of the human mind is opened up and communication becomes possible? What happens when, the light goes on and sort of a new medium opens up and suddenly night becomes day? And McLuhan always used as an example, he would say, like, technologies are never understandable in terms of their contents. We experience their content. But the real implication of a technology is not a content, it's a medium. It's a medium of communication, it's a medium of politics, it's a medium of entertainment. Like right now, in this instant, in this classroom, we are within a whole variety of technological media of communication, starting with these horrible lights in the ceiling. And McLuhan would always say, that the lights turned on, it makes possible to have a class and to do reading and sort of extend our senses into the darkness. And at this instant the lights turned on, that silent, invisible media opens up other possibilities. It opens up other possibilities of extended communication, reorganizing ways of educating ourselves, just the whole vast numbers of things that, electronic lights will bring to us. It also shuts off other things. It shuts down the possibility of real darkness. It shuts down the possibility of really experiencing the depths of night itself. It shuts down the possibility of living outside a mediated culture. Now in this classroom, it's a post-McLuhanite classroom, because we not only have the medium, invisible medium of lights, we also have possibilities for video conferencing. We have full screen arrays in here. We have regular screens, but we also have plasma screens. We have extended ears in the forms of microphones in the ceiling, and the class itself is then being recorded all the while. So really, we might want to live outside technologies, but really, in this classroom at least, the technologies are inside of us. They're structured the way in which this room is organized by the way in which our education is going to happen. And McLuhan would say then the central point is not to understand the content necessarily of the technologies. Contents vary. He said the much more harder, more difficult thing to grasp is that technology are invisible media. And what you're really invisibly worked over and massaged and like almost had radical surgery done to you all the time is by the medium itself. When the medium exists, then it just changes what futures are going to exist. So the second lesson of this is the notion of that technology are invisible media, and media work us over invisibly and will. And McLuhan, in one of his writings, had a really great point. He says, because McLuhan, is always presented as like this utopian, bubble-headed prophet of technology. But if you actually read McLuhan, that is not the case. McLuhan was like a Catholic thinker, and he was agnostic on the question of technology. In fact, he had a bleak view of the world. McLuhan always said over and over again that technology delivers us up to basically the end of culture, if left untempered by human wisdom. And he says, speaking for himself, he says, I study technology because I find myself drowning in the technological vortex. And he says, I view the legacy of my life as simply trying to throw lifelines to people that might come after me. And McLuhan would say, well, what do you say to a population that puts its head, keeps yammering on about freedom and unity, but keeps putting its head under the psychic surgery of new technologies and having its senses numbed and amputated and really visibly stunned, and still calls the whole thing freedom. And so for McLuhan, technologies, the third lesson is technologies are never benign, but technologies are always really violent. Technologies are always doing radical psychic and political surgery on populations, sometimes hijacking whole populations, but always really reworking the ways we think and the ways we communicate and the ways we do commerce within the world itself. They are like speed and violence are like the necessary language, and seduction and fascination are some of the languages of technology itself. So we think we're talking about benign things, and suddenly even the prophet of new technologies comes back and says, no, if we don't have human wisdom and real thought about the ends of these technologies, we're going to be delivered to technodrome. We're going to be delivered to a culture in which we will become servo mechanisms of machine and have servile relationships to technologies itself. And the fourth point that this book would make is that technologies always divide us into crowds, into tribes, or electronic tribes. That technologies always injure part of the human sensoria. They always shut down old ways of seeing and old ways of thinking and open up new ways of thinking. And so the story of every technology is the story of something that has been lost and shut down almost irretrievably, and something that has opened up. And it's a story of sometimes like nostalgic retrievals of old technologies as the content for new technologies. And at the same time, that sometimes we find ourselves thinking that we're just sort of, speeding up towards a accelerating future, but suddenly the whole kind of technoculture within which we live does a big flip, and suddenly we find ourselves traveling backwards very fast. Like, if you listen to the tech hype for the millennium, you would think the future, this wondrous future, was about to unfold. And so far, my experience of the millennium, and check it out against your own, has been this experience of just radical ambivalence. That on the one hand, you have like the ascendancy of globalized, really technologized corporations, really putting their stamp of consumer icons down everywhere in the world. And there's lots of protests against that. It's the anti-globalization movements. At the same time as we have that kind of electronic tribe that we're organized into, there were also other tribes which appeared and they weren't supposed to appear. Suddenly you have tribes of people coming out of cultures that have been oppressed, of who have in fact experienced religiously the effects of globalization and refused to assent. They're called terrorists. Or sometimes you have other tribes of just people engaged like the Zapatistas in Mexico in insurgent politics, who say, really the day that the North American Free Trade Agreement is inaugurated, immediately rebel and say, our culture is being exterminated by this treaty, and our struggle is not just our struggle, it is a human struggle, and you have responsibilities to know what is happening to us. So really, the fourth story of this book is the fact that, in fact, different tribes have emerged. Electronic tribes of globalization, but also electronic tribes sometimes which seem to be very medieval in character. And we're supposedly living in the 21st century electronic culture, but I don't think that's true. I think it's true for certain portions of the globalized population, but I think a lot of other people are living in Sufi mysticism and living within the imaginaire of the 13th and the 14th century. I couldn't follow the war on Bosnia with Serbia and not immediately go back to battlegrounds from the 12th to the 14th century and really realize that for people's political consciousness was really medievalism itself. It didn't have bearings on this century, but it was really medievalism being experienced in terms of its politics, in terms of the memories of what is most, the dearest memories of cultures itself. So the fourth lesson of this, or the fourth kind of way of understanding technology in this book, is that technology organizes us into tribes, sometimes electronic tribes, but there aren't just electronic tribes. There are a lot of media tribes there. There are a lot of political tribes. And what happens then with our politics on this basis? Okay, I've gone on too long. Questions?